We're all haunted by something, but Dr. Stephanie Hawkins has been fascinated by ghosts for as long as she can remember. Hawkins, who is an associate professor in UNT's Department of English, is an expert in late 19th and early 20th century American literature, and has also studied ghosts and hauntings. This spring, she is once again teaching a class called Undead, Ghosts, Vampires, and Zombies in American Literature. So what exactly kicked off her infatuation with ghost stories?
Well, I can answer that in a couple ways. I grew up in a house that I swear must have been haunted. And it was an old house. It has a history of being not old in like a nice sense, not like Victorian or anything fancy, but it was in Carson City, Nevada. And I found out from a kind of a neighbor historian that our house was built on top of an acid factory. And so, of course, as a very imaginative child, we also had a basement. And we had a refrigerator down there that was falling apart and making these strange sounds. So it would, kind of cry out and moan. And the people who had lived there before had kids. And so you'd see kind of remnants of children having lived in that house before, little footprints in the cement that had been left before. And the house also creaked a lot. And even my own grandmother, who would come and babysit on occasion, would say she hated being in my house at night because it sounded like somebody was marching up and down the hallway. So it was just the unique kind of noise of the house, the age of the house. And then when I was in grad school and writing my dissertation, I came across a fascinating sort of episode in American literary history where a lot of the writers that I was interested in were spiritualists. And when I went to school up in Buffalo, New York, I found out that had a really strong history of being part of what's called the burned over district, the area during the late 19th, mid and late 19th century, where there were a lot of revivals. And then there's, of course, a spiritualist community that's still alive today and thriving called Lilydale. Every summer they have they host a big sort of mediumship extravaganza. So people come from all over to talk to a medium. So there's that whole history there that I think conspired to kind of give me that interest and curiosity about the cultural history of the ghost in that particular part of the United States.
Whether it's ghosts, vampires, zombies, or flesh and blood humans, the things we love most are always a little scary. Which, let's face it, is also what makes it so much fun. Even 19th century scientists found themselves enthralled by metaphysical possibilities.
There was actually a society it's called the Society for Psychical Research, founded in the 1880s in England. And in a few years later in the United States, the American Society for Psychical Research and the British Society for Psychical Research. And if you were to Google that, they're still around and they're still doing their work. They're still collecting anecdotes about people who have seen ghosts, and they would collect all of these stories. And then, of course, they would go out ghost hunting and try to, figure out whether it was a real ghost and how do you account for these. They were basically the modern ghost detectives trying to figure out whether this old house was really haunted or whether there was some kind of like seismic activity or some draft or some kind of weird, architectural flaw that was creating the slamming doors and the sounds and things like that. And then they would try to find these fraudulent mediums. And I think people would be surprised to know that some of the best scientists of the day were members of the Society for Psychical Research. Pierre and Marie Curie, who discovered radium and got the Nobel Prize together jointly in 1903, they were members of the Society for Psychical Research. So some of the things that science was discovering, the X-ray in 1896, those sorts of new discoveries kind of generated a lot more interest in the idea of the invisible as a space of possibility, and that maybe there was more that science could discover about these invisible realms.
And though science has largely shied away from the supernatural in the centuries since, The public certainly has not. On this episode of UNT Pod, join me, Erin Crystalis, as I talk with Dr. Hawkins about readers' infatuation with ghost stories, some of the most engrossing works involving the undead, and how her students deal with all of that pesky ambiguity inherent in some of literature's most popular supernatural tales.
No matter which way you go, no matter which way you stay, you're out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind, out of my mind. I was walking with the ghost. I said, please don't insist. I was walking with the ghost. I said, please don't insist. No matter which way you go, no matter which
Well, some might say that love is scary, which is supported by the idea that pretty much any work of art involving love seems to have some subconscious element of fear to it, whether that's fear of commitment or fear of ruining a relationship or fear of rejection. Do you think there's some level of catharsis involved in turning away from the more traditional romantic narratives and exploring the more tangible fears involved in stories about the undead?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that when the course I'm teaching right now about the undead, most of these ghosts have a kind of romantic component. A lot of the motives for haunting come from unrequited love, as in the case of Henry James's story, Sir Edmund Orme, where, this woman has rejected the suitor who she initially said she would marry, and then she sees someone, in her words, she liked better, and decided not to marry him. And of course, he haunts her now after her husband passed away. He appears whenever her daughter, who's now the age of marriage, he appears whenever there's a potential suitor. And so, yeah, there's definitely a kind of way in which our ghosts of lost loves past can come back in these vengeful forms, and warning us not to do something we might regret later.
So you just mentioned the class that you teach about the undead in American literature. Can you tell me a little bit about what students can expect to read and discuss in the class?
Well, I start out with the kind of a traditional approach, which is just to begin with some of the early ghost stories in the 19th century, beginning with Henry James, who has an entire collection of ghost stories, and that's when he first starts writing. And they're fun because they have traditional haunted houses, and they kind of have things that are very familiar to the whole kind of ghost story genre. Of course, the one about the rival lovers and people who don't get to marry the people that they really want to, and then people who avenge themselves later when they kind of lay a trap in advance to like haunt somebody. And so we begin with some of those more traditional stories to kind of flesh out the deeper psychological issues pertaining to ghosts. The idea that ghosts give us access to a privileged kind of vision, alternative forms of knowledge that are not, at the time in the 19th century, the rise of scientific positivism held that the only things that are real are the things that can be seen or experienced with the five senses. And, this is, of course, post-Darwin. So we have a real kind of tension being worked out in the ghost story about what kinds of knowledge count, what kinds of experience can be perceived as real or authentic, verifiable. And so Henry James, whose brother was the American psychologist William James, who wrote the essay, the famous essay called The Will to Believe, talked about how every person is sort of hardwired to believe in something bigger than themselves. And he advocated for, believing even when there's no certainty about the afterlife, to still believe in something and have faith in something beyond the five senses. So, I start them out with that cultural context, for why the 19th century is such a fertile place for the ghost story. Why is it that everybody suddenly was so interested in preserving this space for the spiritual, for the irrational, for things that can't be verified with the senses, right? So then we move on to more contemporary stuff. So we're reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, which for them is much more readable than James, because he writes in such a way that's kind of very complicated, long sentences, very subtle psychological stuff that maybe a 19 or 20-year-old is not quite as wired to read like we are, So we're reading that famous Pulitzer Prize winning novel by Toni Morrison, in which a historical person, Margaret Garner, and escaping slavery, is caught, and rather than see her children return to slavery, she tries to kill them, and she succeeds in killing her youngest, a little girl. And so Morrison describes how, although the historical person was too limiting for a novelist to write about, she really wanted to dig into the psychology of that and to create an experience. She says, I wanted to kidnap the reader and make them experience what it would be like to live at this time, and to kind of put us in the mindset of the mother. How do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you deal with trauma? So then we start talking about ghosts as metaphors for the unresolved elements of the historical past, the kinds of deep wounds that historians don't talk about, but that novelists have the license to talk about, because they can talk about ghosts, because they have that freedom to talk about things that are invisible to the senses.
Well, you mentioned too that a lot of these stories obviously are very psychological. And I feel like a lot of times too, they have a lot of ambiguity. And I'm wondering, for your students, what's their reaction to that? Because it seems like people can go kind of either way when it comes to something feeling maybe a little bit unresolved or unclear.
Yeah, I think that's part of the allure of reading ghost stories, especially the ones written in the 19th century, because there's this, effort to kind of be both scientific and supernatural. And there's actually a term called the fantastic, which was coined in the 1970s to describe this sense of being in this perfect sort of suspension between a supernatural event being really supernatural or accountable by some sort of naturalistic explanation. And so, to kind of go back to my students and ambiguity, they love and hate ambiguity, because I said to them about Beloved, what if this isn't really a ghost? What if there's a way for us to explain the arrival of this, this person who calls herself Beloved, by saying that she's an escaped slave, that she's possibly from Haiti, because there are lots of little clues that suggest that maybe this person is a real person and not a ghost. Oh, they flipped out. They said, no. One of my students said, I would feel so cheated. I would feel so cheated, because then it's not, I've invested all this emotional energy into this ghost, and then I'm cheated at the end to discover that it's not a real ghost. So I think there's a feeling of, wanting that, the reward of the real ghost in the fiction, to have, again, fiction as a refuge for the magical, the enchanting, the kinds of things that our day-to-day ordinary lives sort of, in our day-to-day ordinary experience, don't give us access to. So, ambiguity can be really rewarding, but it can also be maddening.
Well, and it's interesting too, because you've mentioned Henry James a few times, and I feel like in a lot of ways he's kind of most well known for these social and marital narratives involving Europeans and Americans.
Yes.
And it feels like sometimes too that stories involving ghosts or vampires or the undead in some way aren't taken as seriously maybe as other genres. But here's this author who's so well regarded and wrote one of the most famous, ghost stories of all time. I'm wondering if that's a discussion you have with your students in terms of the importance of the genre, as a serious genre in a lot of ways.
I think for them, they grew up with the Twilight series. They grew up with, right now, for instance, on Netflix, they've turned Turn of the Screw into The Haunting of Bly Manor, which I have not seen. My students have told me about it. And there's also the reboot of famous Shirley Jackson novel called The Haunting of Hill House as a series on Netflix. So it's funny because they were popular in the 19th century. Think of Charles Dickens. He's the most famous for, creating the, ghost of Christmas past and kind of these warning ghosts that teach, Ebenezer Scrooge to be kinder and more generous. So I think the ghost story genre is definitely one, in part, not just because of James, because of Morrison and because of more contemporary writers. I don't think it's ever not going to be taken seriously. I think about vampires. I think they fall more into the line of like pulp, right? There's something about the vampire that has a kind of camp appeal, where I think because it has that sort of, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and of course the Anne Rice novels and the Interview with a Vampire film, that the vampire functions in a very different way from the ghost. I was thinking about this earlier because we're going to be talking about Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories, which came out in the 1980s. And I jokingly refer to it as vampire lesbian fiction, because the vampire allows for things, and the ghost story does too, but I think the vampire makes more explicit some of the ways in which homoerotic desire can be expressed, or even alternative lines of kinship. In this particular novel, being of the blood is a way of being part of a bigger extended family that has nothing to do with genealogy, but has to do with a kind of spiritual kinship or a kind of like-mindedness that transcends racial boundaries, gender boundaries, and creates a kind of utopian possibility to talk about alternative forms of communities of feeling or affiliation that's not tribalistic or nationalistic. And zombies too, they're the classic pulp genre. But the thing I'm teaching is anthropological. It comes from famous Black anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston, who collected folklore in her home state of Florida, and then traveled to Haiti and actually trained to become a Bokur, a Haitian voodoo practitioner, and was sworn to secrecy, not to reveal the secrets. And she claims to have seen what she calls a real zombie. Felix Mentor is her last name, and she has a photograph of her. And this, of course, riles the anthropologist, because Hurston bends the boundary between acceptable academic science and the credulity of a believer, of an insider in the culture. So we're going to be reading some of her writing to kind of trouble that relationship between fiction and truth. What kind of truth does fiction tell us, or what kind of lie tell us about reality or truth?
Well, I know you mentioned too that, in your class that typically you start with works of the 19th century. I'm wondering though, if you could talk about maybe when and where some of the first recorded ghost stories first appear.
This is going way outside my expertise, but I can tell you that when I do teach my class, I talk about a few things that have to do with very familiar ghost stories. If you identify as Christian or Jewish, Lazarus might be the person you think of as like the first zombie. He's rising from the dead, famously. And of course, we're coming up on the celebration of Lent and the great resurrection, right, of of Christ from the tomb. So we have, of course, deeply embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition, a kind of deeply held belief. And then there's, of course, Tibetan Buddhism has this concept of the tulka, and later taken up as the tulpa, in popular culture as a kind of thought emanation that becomes palpable and physical. As more and more people kind of fixate on this idea, it sort of takes on a life of its own, has its own will, has its own being, and sort of a collective entity that's created out of collective belief. Then there's, of course, the golem from the Judaic tradition, a kind of clay figure that moves and does things, but is kind of in between living and dead, a kind of figure that becomes a metaphor for all kinds of issues. So I think wherever humans have been, there have always been ghosts or some kind of concept of something that dwells between the living and the dead, and kind of functions as a bridge between those two, the known and the unknown, the seen and the unseen. We need some sort of mediating thing to help us make sense of what we don't know, and to give us some humility about how much we know and whether we can really trust what we know.
Well, is that why you think people are so infatuated with these narratives? I mean, because we see them everywhere in books and in pop culture. What do you think it is exactly about the undead that just fascinates people so much?
I think for me, I mean, I'll just speak personally. I think it's a desire for connection, a connection with the past, a connection to ancestors that have departed before we ever had an opportunity to get to know their story. A desire, just a hunger for story, a hunger for making meaning out of chaos, of our bodies disintegrating and leaving this earth, and a kind of desire to preserve what was the very vital and real and unique personality of those people who were gone. And I think there's that, and there's also this anxiety and kind of titillating fear that is both exciting and scary. That's always part of the attraction to the supernatural. I think this could be scary, but it's also deeply reassuring, is that, there's something that does survive, whether in the form of history or in the form of story. But then there's also that fear that, well, what if the beyond is no real liberation from suffering? What if being trapped? I think there's something horrifying about the restless, hungry spirit that cannot move beyond the realm of the living, but can't fully participate in it. And I think that's the kind of metaphor for maybe what many people are feeling at this time about, I'm ready to kind of go back to normal, or I'm ready to move on to the next thing, and I can't. I think in some ways it speaks to that when we all have those moments in our lives where we're stuck for whatever reason in a situation, in a circumstance, in a subject position of marginality, that the ghost gives us that something we can identify with, that reflects our fears, reflects our anxieties, and does give us hope at the same time. So talk about ambiguity. It is the embodiment of everything that is ambiguous about being human and the human condition.
I'm wondering what you would consider to be some must-read ghost stories, and also if you could talk a little bit about your own personal favorite ghost story.
It's funny, whenever anybody asks an English professor what their favorite book is, it's like my mind goes blank, to be honest with you. I was thinking about this, and I really love The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I would say that's a must read because it is so contemporary and it really holds up over time. And also if you were somebody who likes to kind of mentally play the game of, is this real or is this, natural? Is this supernatural or natural? That's one that does do a good job of kind of suspending it. And I like the kind that are sort of like true crime versions of the ghost story, because they involve some detective work. And especially when you have the unreliable narrator, like you get in Edgar Allan Poe, right? So Shirley Jackson has that wonderful narrator who you don't know whether you believe in or not. And Turn of the Screw does the same thing with The Governess. So I consider that must read. I really think Beloved is a must read. It's gripping. It's a satisfying ghost story on so many different levels. I consider that just one of the very best of, our generation, really. And as for kind of older ghost stories, there, some of those short ghost stories by James, they're not read very often now, but I think they deserve more attention than they've gotten. And they're very readable compared to some of his later, Wings of the Dove, which I kind of jokingly call the leaden wings of the dove, because it's just such a slog to get through. Some of his bigger novels that he went over back in 1908, become even really like cement bricks, But some of his early ghost stories are just so readable. The Romance of Certain Old Clothes, which is sort of a fun read because it's about two sisters duking it out for the same guy. And I won't spoil it or anything, but the ghost has some fun revenge on the sister. And then, so that some of the ghost story collections, M.R. James, A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, is a classic. Sheridan Le Fanu, he writes wonderful. There's a great book called Great Tales of the Supernatural that I often teach when it's not focused strictly on American lit. It kind of covers the range of ghost stories from England and the US during that time period, 19th century. But, every culture has something. Every tradition has something. The Japanese have wonderful ghost stories. Isabel Allende, The House of Spirits, is another wonderful one that deserves reading. It's kind of this epic story about generational haunting. So there's just too many to recommend. You could really just spend your entire life reading it and never finish, never really find the end of it, because there's so much good stuff being written all the time.
I'm wondering too what the experience is like for you of teaching some of these stories, because obviously, a big part of ghost stories is a surprise and figuring out what's going on. And clearly, what's going to happen, but you get to see your students experience that and be surprised by these narratives. So what is it like for you to kind of get to maybe relive that process of reading a novel for the first time through your students?
There's nothing like experiencing it through the eyes of students, because it's almost like they give me the great joy and pleasure of experiencing something for the first time, because they don't know how it ends. I get to watch one of my favorite things, which is cognitive dissonance. This sort of, I can't believe that she's acting this way, where they get personally involved. And I love that, because that really takes it down to what we all, I think, value about reading fiction and reading literature, is that it puts us in a completely different, we get to occupy someone else's brain and someone else's body. And we start thinking about, well, what choices would we do? What choices would we make differently? Or we begin to ask questions like, I would never do that. Why is this person doing that? The reaction of sort of sheer disbelief. I can't believe this person is acting this way. She's 18. She's acting like she's 12, as though, that never happens. The judgments, they don't hold back. It really is visceral. the response people have, I think, to this genre of the undead, and I think it's because we're not told we have to treat it like Shakespeare. We have to revere it in this kind of careful way. We can kind of engage it at the level of folklore, stories that we would sit around the campfire telling to each other. And so there's no need to hold back. There's no need to treat it like it's somehow high art that we have to learn how to appreciate or consume in the right ways, right? There's no specialized language or discourse that we need to help us understand it. And that's not to say that Shakespeare, yes, he was that for his time period, and he has all these wonderful ghosts too. So some of the best literature about ghosts might be Hamlet or Macbeth. But I think because it's American literature, I think my students are reacting like, this is mine. I own this, and I can say whatever I want about it.
Thank you for listening to UNT Pod. If you'd like to learn more about any of the novels Dr. Hawkins mentioned in the episode, please see the links in our show notes. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at UNT Social and on Instagram at UNT. Until next time, be safe.